Welcome back to TalesBlip. Today's story is The Consequences of a Broken Childhood. Hi, I'm Ethan Parker, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a mechanic, and I have a story that's haunted me for years. It's a story of regret, fear, and anger, all woven together into a single moment that changed my life forever. This is my truth. After that day, nothing was the same. I felt like I was living in someone else's life, like I was watching everything from a distance, detached and numb. The guilt of what I had done, of taking a life, even if it was someone as awful as Ashton, ate at me every single day. I wasn't sure what I expected when I returned to face the aftermath, but the reality was worse than I had imagined. Tiffany's face when she opened the door haunts me to this day. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she reached out to me. For a moment, I thought she might hit me, scream at me, or tell me to leave, but she didn't. Instead, she just stood there, looking lost, as if the ground beneath her had crumbled. She asked me why, over and over again. "Why did you do it, Ethan? Why didn't you just walk away?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. There are no words that could justify what I did, no explanation that could make it okay. I had taken a life, and there was no undoing that. I tried to explain myself, stumbling over my words, but it all sounded hollow. The truth was that I had lost control, that years of pent-up anger and frustration had boiled over in that moment. And I couldn't stop myself. I had let Ashton's words, his taunts, and his presence get under my skin, and I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. Tiffany didn't scream at me like I expected. Instead, she cried. She broke down in front of me, her sobs racking her body. Seeing her like that shattered me. I had caused this. I had brought this pain into her life. She had already been through so much with Ashton, years of manipulation and abuse, and now, because of me, she was dealing with something even worse. As the days passed, the weight of what I had done became unbearable. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ashton's face, lifeless on the floor. I saw Tiffany, her tears, her broken expression. I felt trapped in my own head, unable to escape the guilt. It was like drowning in an ocean of regret, and no matter how hard I tried to swim to the surface, I kept sinking deeper. The police came eventually. They knocked on Tiffany's door, asking questions, wanting to know what had happened. I had known this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier. The officer's stern face, the way he looked at me, it felt like I was already condemned. Tiffany had called them, of course. She had no choice. Ashton's body was found in her apartment, and she had to explain why. I knew I had to face the consequences, but the thought of going to jail, of spending years behind bars, terrified me. I wasn't a hardened criminal. I wasn't a murderer. But that didn't change the fact that I had killed someone. They took me to the station for questioning. It was surreal, sitting in that cold, sterile room with the bright lights overhead. The detective sat across from me, his eyes boring into mine, waiting for me to confess. I could feel my hands shaking, sweat beading on my forehead. I wanted to tell them everything, to explain that I hadn't meant for it to happen, that I had acted in self-defense. But the truth was messy, and I knew that no matter what I said, it wouldn't erase what I had done. I told them the basics, that Ashton had confronted me, that we had gotten into a fight, that it had escalated, and that I had lost control. I didn't sugarcoat it, but I didn't give them every detail either. I couldn't bring myself to relive that moment again, not like that. Tiffany backed me up. She told them about Ashton, about the way he had treated her, about the years of abuse she had suffered at his hands. She told them that Ashton had a violent temper, that he had threatened me. She tried to paint a picture of self-defense, of me protecting her from a dangerous man. I could see the pain in her eyes as she spoke. I knew that she was trying to help me, but I also knew that it didn't make the situation any less complicated. The police didn't arrest me right away. They said they had to investigate, to gather evidence, to figure out what had really happened. I was relieved, but it was a temporary reprieve. I knew the investigation would lead them back to me eventually. There was no hiding from the truth. In the weeks that followed, the strain on my relationship with Tiffany became unbearable. We tried to move forward, but there was always this unspoken tension between us, like a wall we couldn't break through. Every time she looked at me, I could see the hurt in her eyes. She was torn between her love for me and the reality of what I had done. I could feel her pulling away from me, little by little. She stopped talking as much. She became distant, spending more time by herself. When we were together, it was awkward, like we didn't know how to be around each other anymore. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her how sorry I was, but I didn't know how. Every time I tried, the words got stuck in my throat. One night, she finally broke down. We were sitting in the living room, the silence between us heavy, and she just started crying. She told me that she didn't know how to feel anymore. She said she loved me, but she couldn't get past what had happened. She couldn't stop thinking about Ashton, about the life I had taken. "I know he was awful," she said, her voice shaking. "I know he hurt me, and I know he deserved to pay for what he did, but I don't know if I can live with this, Ethan. I don't know if I can live with knowing that you killed someone." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known she was struggling, but hearing her say it out loud made it all so real. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that I felt the same way, but I didn't know if that would make any difference. The truth was, I didn't know how to live with it either. Every day, I wrestled with the guilt, the shame, the horror of what I had done. But hearing Tiffany say it out loud made me realize just how broken things had become between us. We tried to keep going after that, but it was clear that something had shifted. We weren't the same people we had been before. The weight of what had happened hung over us like a cloud, and no matter how hard we tried to move forward, it kept pulling us back. Months later, the legal process caught up with me. I was charged with manslaughter. The trial was a blur, long, exhausting, and filled with moments that I'll never forget. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing the prosecutor paint me as a violent, reckless man, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to endure. They brought out every detail of my life, dissecting it for the jury to see. They showed photos of Ashton, spoke about his injuries, and replayed the events of that night over and over again. It was as if they were trying to rip me apart piece by piece. Tiffany testified on my behalf. She told the court about Ashton's abusive behavior, about the way he had terrorized her for years. She said that I had acted out of self-defense, that I hadn't meant to kill him. But even as she spoke, I could see the pain in her eyes. She was doing this for me, but it was tearing her apart. The trial dragged on for weeks, and with every passing day, the weight of it all grew heavier. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, and when they finally returned with a verdict, my heart was pounding in my chest. They found me guilty of manslaughter, but I was spared the harshest sentence. The judge acknowledged the abuse Ashton had inflicted on Tiffany, and while that didn't excuse what I had done, it provided some context. I was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. I remember Tiffany's face when the verdict was read. She didn't cry, but I could see the devastation in her eyes. She didn't come to see me after that. I think she needed to distance herself from everything. To try to find some sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. Prison was a wake-up call. I had never been the kind of person who imagined myself behind bars, but there I was, surrounded by people who had done far worse than I had. In some ways, it was easier than being on the outside. There was no pretense, no pretending that everything was okay. In prison, everyone knew what I had done, and there was no hiding from it. I spent a lot of time thinking about Tiffany, about how things had gone so wrong. I thought about Ashton, about the moment I lost control, and about the choices I had made that led me to this place. I had a lot of time to reflect on my life, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been carrying anger and resentment for years. It wasn't just about Ashton. It was about all the things in my life that I felt powerless to control. Being in prison gave me a chance to confront those feelings head-on. It wasn't easy, but I knew that if I ever wanted to move forward, I had to face the darkness inside of me. I started talking to a counselor in the prison, someone who helped me work through the trauma of my past and the guilt of my actions. It was a long, painful process, but it was also necessary. When I was finally released on parole after 3 years, I wasn't the same person who had walked into that courtroom. I had changed. I had grown. But I also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up, and I wasn't sure where to start. Tiffany had moved on. She was living in another city, and from what I heard, she was doing well. Part of me wanted to reach out to her, to see if there was any chance of rekindling what we had, but I knew that it was best to let her go. She deserved a fresh start, free from the weight of our shared history. As for me, I'm still trying to figure out what my future looks like. I found work as a mechanic again, and I'm doing my best to stay out of trouble. But the guilt is always there, lingering in the back of my mind. I don't know if it will ever go away completely, but I'm learning to live with it, to accept the mistakes I've made, and to try to be a better person moving forward. In the end, I know that I can never undo what happened. I can't bring Ashton back, and I can't erase the pain I caused Tiffany. But I can try to make amends in whatever way I can, even if it's just by living a life that honors the lessons I've learned along the way.